Hey, this is Anthony, Davis, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about the structure and function of the spine, and I'll get into a few details as it relates to movement and yoga. So first, a brief overview. As you can see in the top left, we've got the major divisions of the spine, starting from top to bottom. We have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 fused sacral vertebrae, which fused means we're not going to see movement in between those segments, and 4 fused coccyx. Sometimes it's not 4. Sometimes I've heard that it's 3. But the point is, we've got a small number of fused coccyx. That's your tailbone. Okay, now the cervical vertebra at the top here, you'll notice an inward curvature. So when we look at the spine, it's very important to notice that the spine is curvy. It is not straight up and down, and this curvy shape allows for more shock absorbance. It allows us to stand upright. The fact that we are bipedal organisms, that we walk on 2 feet, we have to have this curvy spine to support us. So at the top, we have what's called a lordotic curve, a forward-facing curve of the spine, and we have a matching lordotic curve in the lumbar spine here, and I'll show you lumbar right there. Now, the opposite of lordotic is kyphotic, and that is demonstrated by the sacral and thoracic. So here's your thoracic, which is kyphotic, and the sacral, which is kyphotic as well. So just notice that when we are in an anatomically neutral position, which is one thing that in yoga we like to strive for, and in exercise it's something people emphasize a lot, is maintaining neutral spine during movements, if possible, if at all possible. And just remember that neutral is a little bit curvy. So bracing the belly in to brace the spine often results in, you can imagine this here, that if I've got the abdominal muscles on here and I hollow those out like this, right? That's putting pressure this direction towards the back of the spine, which can then take this nice lordotic curve of the spine and start to flatten it out, okay? And we don't want to flatten out the spine because, well, if for no other reason than that it is not neutral, and we would prefer to have a neutral spine. Okay, that means all the discs are neutrally compressed, right? We don't have excessive anterior compression, like excessive compression on the front side of the discs or on the back side. Okay, the other thing that I'd like to bring attention to here is the size of the vertebrae as they go from top to bottom. You'll notice that at the base of the spine, we've got a very wide base of support, and force, anything that we're carrying, a heavy load, or if we're jumping and running or whatever, that force is going to be distributed along a larger surface area. So we can take more weight in the lumbar spine as long as it's properly braced, at the cervical vertebrae, because the small size of the vertebral bodies, which is kind of the larger, the portion that I've outlined here in red, the size is just smaller, and we can't distribute the force as effectively across a wide surface area, which means that each square centimeter takes a larger amount of pounds, a larger weight per square centimeter. And what that means is that we're squishing the vertebrae, or excuse me, we're squishing the vertebral discs, those little sort of gelatinous discs that sit between the vertebral bodies. And if those little discs get squished too much, all kinds of bad stuff starts to happen. So it's just important to notice that although we can, carry a heavy load, maybe a backpack, and then most of the load is from shoulders down. We would see the same thing in a barbell squat, right? So the lumbar spine can take a lot of weight as long as it's braced properly, right? However, if we start to take that same load, say you're doing a headstand and you load down here from head down, then the neck just can't take as much weight. It simply cannot take as much weight as the lumbar spine. It's just not possible to take as much weight. Now, the specifics of exactly how much weight is safe to bear on the head versus the lumbar spine, I don't have an answer for that. But generally speaking, our necks were built to hold our heads up. We were not built to hold extra weight above and beyond the weight of our heads. And we find that even with a slight forward head position where the neck is, here we go, just a little bit forward and the head is here, right? Which we do when we're looking at a computer or, our cell phones or whatever. So when we're here, okay, that was a terrible drawing, but we see that we get all kinds of neck pain, even with our heads just a little bit forward because of the extra weight that we have to bear in the muscles of the back of the neck. So if just having our head shift a little bit forward over a long period of time can start to cause neck problems and even sometimes disc issues, then the idea of bearing weight on the top of the head starts to seem rather ridiculous. So tripod headstands, things like that, in my book, anatomically speaking, are just out of the picture completely. I know that's sad for some of us, but the fact is that, even in cultures where people are used to this, that they carry stuff on top of their heads all the time, and we might expect that they would become more resilient, that they would have fewer neck issues. It turns out that's really not the case, that they still suffer in the same way that, that people who don't carry stuff on the top of their heads suffer from neck pain. So they're not especially resilient just because they carry stuff on their head all the time. Okay, the next thing that I'd like to talk about is that different areas of the spine move differently, meaning some areas of the spine let you turn your body from left to right. Some of them let you look up and down or bend forward and backwards. Some of them let you do like a side bend, or if one hand reaches overhead and you kind of bend a little sideways. And it's important to recognize this because we should seek to take advantage of that, use the proper areas of the spine for proper movement, but also be aware that because, for example, the lumbar spine is really good at forward and backward bending, and if we try and force too much forward or backward bending in other areas of the spine, what will happen is that force will then eventually find its way to your lumbar spine where it's really good at forward and backward bending. And then it'll overcompensate in the lumbar spine, and you'll bend too far forward or back in the lumbar spine, especially in the junction where the thoracic spine meets the lumbar spine. I'll just show you why that is. I'm not going to get into too much detail on these joints here, but I just want to show you that the topmost joint here, where the atlas bone meets the occipital bone, that's basically where you look up and down. It's almost all of your ability to look up and down. I'm simplifying, but that's the point. The next joint here is where you're going to get all of your left and right movement, and that's because there's this little guy here in the center, and it fits in like a little pivot, and the top bone rotates around that little protrusion. It's called the dens. So that's almost all of your ability to look left and right. Okay. Next is the angle here of the cervical spine. The angle of these facet joints is it's kind of like at a 45-degree angle, kind of flat. So the angle of these, if it's two slidey surfaces and they slide against each other, basically you're going to be able to either look a little bit from side to side, you'll rotate, or there's going to be a little bit of lateral bending, so side bending. Okay. I'm going to have to get rid of that in a second. The angle of the facet joints in the thoracic spine are basically straight up and down. So you can see that here, almost entirely straight up and down. So if they slide against each other, basically all they're going to do is side bend. They can't really move forward and back. They can't really rotate too much. And not to mention the ribs and being in the way kind of screws with their ability to rotate from side to side anyway. But they can do a lot of side bending. And so that's where you'll find that. The lumbar spine is basically forward and back, and that's because of the angle, again, of these facet joints, where they're basically straight up and down. And so if both of these at the same time start to move, then your spine will move forward and back. So that's a really, really just general overview of why the spine moves in the direction it does. But just know, cervical, a little bit of rotation, some lateral bending. Most of your up and down movement is from one joint, the top joint. Most of the side to side is going to be from the axial joint. And then the thoracic spine is going to be side to side bending, and the lumbar spine is going to be forward and backward bending. Okay, cool. That's enough for now. I'll put a video on muscles out soon.